Are you ready, Kara?
Yeah.
Okay, this story is called The Masked Ball by
Mask ball.
Seabury Quinn from 1947. Halfway down the block, Holloway came to a halt, a grin of self-derision on his face. Chump, he muttered. If I had a little more sense, I'd be a first-class half-wit. He had been in New Orleans 3 days, crammed his time with sightseeing, and as a climax to his trip had dined at Franchetti's, which was the indirect reason for his present predicament.
Oh.
If you know New Orleans at all, you know you do not merely eat at Franchetti's, you dine there, which is not at all the same thing. He had started with a green turtle soup with clear dry sherry, followed it with oysters Rockefeller washed down with Iroy 93, then filet of pompano with bar tremiere and breast of guinea hen under glass with Newt St. George's, and for dessert a bowl of frozen strawberries and half-melted vanilla ice cream with brandy and Cointreau poured over them. Dinner had consumed 2 hours, and by the time he drained his demitasse of pungent chicory coffee, he was more than merely comfortably fuddled and inclined to let events take their course without assistance from him. It was the eve of Ash Wednesday, and the tide of carnival, which had been rising steadily since Twelfth Night, had reached full flood. He had considered hiring a domino and mask and going down Canal Street to watch the parade of Comus, but at the Costumieres in Conti Street he had allowed himself to be over-persuaded. A domino, a simple mask, monsieur? The proprietaire had asked in shocked, grieved tones. For you? But no, you cannot mean it. It would be unthinkable. Attend to me. Wait 1 little minute while I select a costume just for you. He was a tiny man, the costumer, all full of bows and gestures, as bustling and officious as a blue bottle fly. His hair was thin and gray, his little pointed beard and wisp of waxed mustache might have been molded out of burnished pewter, and his small, deep-set eyes were very bright behind the lenses of black-rimmed pince-nez, from which trailed a broad black ribbon. While Holloway waited, he rummaged through a stack of cardboard boxes almost large as steamer trunks, humming a small tune to himself. Presently he came back smiling broadly, and with something of the air of a magician about to produce a rabbit from a high hat, dragged out his find and held it up for admiration. Voila! He exclaimed triumphantly. Is it not incroyable? Is it not made to order for monsieur? To set his special type off as a frame must complete a complimented picture. But yes, of course. The costume was by no stretch of imagination to be called fancy. It consisted of a fringed buckskin shirt, worked with wampum and stained baby porcupine quills at neck and cuffs, a pair of buckskin breeches, long buckskin leggings, deeply fringed, and a pair of moccasins on which the beaded design of the jacket had been repeated. To top it off, there was a coonskin cap with the hair left on and a wisp of ringed tail swinging from the back. It is the dress of a coureur de bois, not just a modern imitation, but a true historical antique, the little man explained. One worn by the so formidable scouts who kept the forest trails open for the government when Louisiana was France and New Orleans the capital of a great new empire. Yes, certainly. He stepped back, dragged a full-length mirror forward, and held the buckskin garments out to Holloway. Put them on, monsieur, he urged. Regard yourself in them, and say if I have not the flair for costuming a patron in accordance with his character and physique. The costume fitted Holloway as if it had been tailored to his measure, and as he viewed himself in the long mirror, he had to admit that it complimented him, as the proprietor had declared. Holloway was long and rangy, 6 feet in his stockings, loosely jointed, agile, but inclined to be deliberate in his movements. A tennis player since his 10th year, a veteran of 3 years in the Southwest Pacific, he had not an ounce of surplus flesh on his big frame, though he tipped the scales at an even 180. As he surveyed himself in the glass, it seemed as if a century and more had been rolled back, and he saw one of Governor Kerlerek's Kentucky mercenaries looking back at him. He conceded. It's not half bad, but if I'm to be tricked out as a coureur de bois, I ought to have some armament. Perfectly, monsieur. The proprietor was delighted. Me, I have just what is needed. Oh, yes. The weapon he produced from an old brass-bound chest was a museum piece, a flintlock rifle with a long octagonal barrel, walnut stock with brass butt plate, and a wooden ramrod. Its rear sight was a brass notch, its forward one a small button of silver. With it went 2 wooden powder flasks, one for the rifle, the other for the finer priming powder, and a buckskin bag of bullets. Holloway slung the rawhide thongs of the ammunition carriers over his shoulders and weighed the gun critically. It was a sweetly balanced piece, some 50 inches long from butt plate to muzzle, and as he laid his cheek against the hollow carved for it in the dark walnut stock, he realized here was a precision weapon, slower in action and with less striking power than the M1 he had been used to in the Pacific, but accurate to a hair's width within its rather short range. "Does this go with the suit?" he asked incredulously. "It must be worth—" "No matter, monsieur," the costumer broke in. "Me, I do not deal in trash. All my costumes are authentic. My equipment genuine, I assure you."
Hey, Mama or Daddy.
Yes.
Can I watch my tablet because I'm bored of this one?
You're bored with the story?
Yeah.
Very well. Part 2 tomorrow, I guess. "No matter, monsieur," the costumer broke in. "Me, I do not deal in trash. All my costumes are authentic, all my equipment genuine, I assure you." Darkness had begun to fall, and purple shadows gathered in the narrow street as he emerged from the costumers with a long rifle cradled in the bend of his left elbow, and a half-mask hiding the upper portion of his face and giving him a comfortable feeling of anonymity. The effects of his excellent dinner were still with him, and somehow he made several wrong turnings and found himself in Basin Street instead of Canal, where already crowds were gathering to watch the gorgeous spectacle of the parade. Behind him, looking like a giant barrel laid on its side, rose the roof of the municipal auditorium. A little to his left were the tall, whitewashed walls of the old cemetery, and beyond the iron grill of its gate rose the ornate 3-storied tomb of the Widow Paris, once famous as a voodoo priestess. Behind the tomb, as tightly packed as soldiers marching in close formation, the lime-washed sepulchres of long-dead citizens of New Orleans stood rank on solid rank. "Now, let's see," he murmured. "Rampart Street should be that way. If I walk down it, I'll come to Canal and—" The sharp metallic click of a gate latch broke through his unilateral conversation, and he looked up just in time to see a girl emerge from the old graveyard. Even at the little distance of the street's width, he could not distinguish much of her, for a dark cloak covered her from neck to heels, enveloping her completely as an Arab woman's burnous, but her walk was graceful as a dancer's movements, a cadenced, sensuous swinging of the hips and breasts that was innate and unconscious as breathing, but none the less provocative, and as she turned her head so unconcernedly that he was sure she was aware of his presence, he caught a fleeting glimpse of her face, perfect oval with a small, sharp chin, a small straight nose, and hair that curled in a halo of tiny jet-black ringlets around her brow and ears. Then she was gone, her dark cloak blending with the violet shadows till it seemed a part of them. Holloway had an odd, eerie feeling, a sort of sudden stab of poignant yearning. He had been restless, with the restlessness none but the soldier trying desperately to reaccustom himself to civilian life can understand, since he had left the separation center. New York, which he had dreamed of with a longing half painful, half ecstatic, was somehow disappointing. Life had gone on without him for 3 years. His old friends had married or formed other interests, and one and all were intent on business. "How are you? Glad to see you. Goodbye now," had been the universal formula, and he was terribly lonesome. His old job waited for him, but somehow it seemed to have lost its attraction. "Make up your mind, man. Are you coming back or aren't you?" Wilbur Flacker had asked. "We've got a slew of work in the office. 5 new accounts came in yesterday, and we can use a good copywriter. We want to do the right thing by the returned soldier, of course, but if you don't want the job—" On sudden inspiration, he had taken a train for New Orleans. He didn't need to give Flacker a final answer till Monday. In the meantime, he might find surcease from restlessness in the gaiety of Mardi Gras. So there he was, due to go back tomorrow on the morning train, and still as lonesome as a cat in a strange alley, still mentally at sea. That girl, what had there been about her to attract him so suddenly and powerfully? It couldn't have been love, or even the quick passion of the predatory male. He had no idea whether she were thin or chubby. His glimpse of her face had been only momentary. Yet there it was, as if far down in his subconscious a deep layer of desire had stirred and trembled. He hesitated for a moment, then set out after her, his long stride eating up the little distance separating them. An immense, inarticulate desire seemed to surge through him. For the moment, nothing in the world seemed so important as to speak to this only half-glimpsed girl who had glanced at him so briefly across her cloaked shoulder. Overtaking her should have been easy, but somehow gathering darkness, unfamiliar streets, and perhaps his own eagerness combined to thwart him. So here he was, as much at fault as a hound when the fox takes to a brook, gazing down an empty, shadow-haunted street with no sign of his quarry in sight. Chump, he repeated to himself, of all the chuckle-headed plop. Something struck the sidewalk beside him with a soft impact, and he looked down to see a white camellia at his feet. Now where the devil did that come from, he began, when a light laugh sounded just above him. The house before which he stood was typical of the older buildings in the Vieux Carré, the old French Quarter. Sitting back some 8 or 10 feet from the sidewalk, it had double porches or galleries before it, supported by intricately wrought iron grill work. The lower gallery at street level was without railing, but the upper was guarded by a balustrade of quaintly designed iron scroll work. "Mon fleuron, s'il vous plaît, monsieur," came the command in a soft, high voice. "My flower, if you please." A girl leaned laughing from the balcony, her slim, bare arm extended toward him, and her slender fingers reaching for the flower at his feet. The pale light of the newly risen moon hung round her like a nimbus, and he recognized her instantly, the lady of the cemetery. "Oh, hello," he greeted inanely. "I'd been wondering—" "Ma fleur," she interrupted imperiously. "Toss it up to me instantly, if you please." He threw the white bloom up, but it fell just short of her questing fingers, and she laughed delightedly as he caught it before it could strike the pavement again. "Encore," she ordered. "Try again, great clumsy one." Once more he tossed the blossom up, and once again, but each time it eluded her grasp. "C'est sans profit," she told him finally. "You lack the skill, or I the length of arm, it seems. Bring her up to me, if you please." This was more than he had hoped for. "You mean I may come up?" "But naturally. What is there to fear? Although I have the teeth, I shall perhaps not bite you." The street door of the house was unlatched, and Holloway pushed it back, groped through a narrow, almost lightless hall, and up a flight of narrow, winding stairs. She waited for him on the balcony, and close up she was even lovelier than he had realized. Her face was pale, colorless, and fine-textured as a magnolia petal, but her lips were brilliant red. Her black hair, worn in a long bob with curls about the brow and neck, was positively gleaming, and he knew instinctively that the ringlets had not been put in with a hot iron. Beneath the haughty arch of slender brows her eyes were dark and soft. He could not say if they were black or pansy purple, but they were beaming with good humor, and the smile upon her crimson lips pushed a small dimple in her cheek. He began ineptly, for suddenly he felt tongue-tied. But she saved the situation. "Ma fleur, monsieur," she ordered with mock hauteur, as she held out her hand. Then, with a sudden, rippling laugh, "Mais non." She turned her back to him. "But no, into your hand it fell. It is you that must set it back into its proper place." She bent her head, and pointed to the curl in which she wished the flower set. "Come, monsieur, I wait upon you." Her hair was almost incredibly soft and fine as it brushed his fingers, and his hand trembled as he put the flower in place and took quick stock of her. She made him think of ladies he had seen pictured in old French prints. Her gown was China silk, so heavy that it hung as straight as if it had been weighted at the hem, yet so sheer
that it showed the lovely shadow of her figure. It was white, high-waisted, and cut with a low neckline, and tiny shoulder-puff sleeves that showed her lovely arms off to perfection. Beneath her bosom was a sash of pale blue silk that tied at the back underneath her shoulders in a coquettish knot, and trailed its fringed ends almost to her dress hem. Her slim, small feet were stockingless, and shod with sandals fastened with cross-straps of purple ribbon laced across the instep and high up the ankle. Save for the small gold rings that shone in her ears, she wore no ornaments of any kind. "Good Lord," he breathed as he set the white flower in place among the gleaming black curl. "Comment?" She looked across her shoulder, arching her brows at him. "What is it that you say?" "You're lovely." "Monsieur." The laugh that rippled from her lips was like the sound of water poured from a tall silver vase. "But it is you who say the pretty things. Poor little Clotilde Deschamps. She is ugly like a frog, and scrawny like the plucked pullet. Yet you say that she is lovely." "Her, how can you say such utter flattery? No matter, I delight in it. We shall sit here tete-a-tete, and you shall tell me monstrous complimentary lies, and I shall believe them all. Come." She took his hand and led him to a sofa standing by the wall, dropped down on it, and drew him down beside her. "Commence," she ordered arrogantly. "Lie to me, grand comme le bras, as long as your arm. Tell me I am lovely, me." She moved a little closer, and her soft hair brushed his cheek, its perfume fresh and sweet. Her eyes were wide and soft, and her mouth tender. "You meant it, Rament?" Wine could not have raced his blood faster than it was racing with the intoxication of her nearness and the music of her voice. "Lovely," he whispered, and his heart beat so that he could hardly force the word out. Her eyelids lowered slowly, as those of one who falls into a gentle sleep might do, and her lips parted like the petals of a flower. "Embrasse-moi," she whispered, and put her hands up to his cheeks, drawing his mouth down to hers. Her lips were smooth and soft as the flower petals in her hair. Her arms were warm and tender around his neck. The sweetness of her perfumed body pressed against his was like an enervating drug. A humming sounded in his ears. Everything went dark round him, and a spell of lassitude crept over him. He was fainting, swooning, dying, and he did not care. Nothing mattered. Nothing. Abruptly she pushed him from her and rose to her feet. "We must make haste," she told him, almost matter-of-factly. "Await me here while I prepare my toilette. I shall be but 1 moment, perhaps 2 or 3, no longer." "Your toilette?" he echoed. "Why?" "Ah, bah!" She laughed as one might laugh at the inept question of a dull child. "You would not have me put the shame on you by going to the bal masque in such clothes as these?" There was a patter of small feet upon the gallery floor, and she was gone. Holloway rose from the couch and walked to the porch rail. Things were happening so fast he couldn't keep pace with them. He had found her, kissed her. Now it seemed she was taking him to a masked ball. He looked down on the darkened street. Somehow it seemed different. The shadows seemed to cluster more thickly. The street lamps burned less brightly, and in the changed light the houses lining the curbs seemed less ancient. From somewhere far away there came the muted throbbing of a drum, not the rhythmic ratapan of a marching cadence, but a dull, persistent thrumming, urging and impelling. There was insistence and abandon in the hollow booming of the taut parchment. He felt vaguely uncomfortable, recalling stories of the voodoo rites of the blacks practiced in the days when Jackson Park was Congo Square. But the chill vanished, and he smiled as from the house there came the sound of singing, a tune that was at once both sad and gay, as if the singer smiled through her tears. He could not distinguish the words, for they were in Creole, but the voice was charming, with the throaty, velvety quality that is the heritage of Latin races. Voila! Once more the pit-pat of her feet sounded, and she stood framed in the oblong of the doorway, slim and glowing. Her tightly curling hair had been combed high and tied with a fillet of white silk at the front, of which an aigrette plume was fastened by a small pearl brooch. In her ears were pearls almost as large as filberts, and round her neck there lay another strand of pearls that made him catch his breath not once but twice. First, because the pearls were almost beyond price, and second, because the neck they rested on was almost the exact color of the pearls. Her gown of heavy white brocaded silk was cut low at the front and back, with little puff sleeves at the shoulders, tight at the bosom, but flaring sharply from a high-set waist. Across her shoulders draped a scarf of silver tissue, which hung down either side like the stole of a cleric. Her narrow feet were shod with satin slippers of pale shell pink, flat-soled and heelless as a ballerina's shoes, and laced across the instep and about the ankles with narrow ribbons. He felt his heart melt as he looked at her. The dim, misty black hair, the dark eyes like deep pools of shadow in the pale oval of her face, the smiling scarlet mouth, not a flaw in her from small head to tiny feet, her figure fine drawn as a thoroughbred's, slim, delicate, with dainty wrists and ankles and a neck like the stem of a flower, white and frail as a narcissus, and very beautiful. "Am I not truly elegant?" she demanded as she took her skirts in her hands, and dropped him a deep curtsy. "I shall not put to shame upon you, brave coureur de bois. One moment, while I set my visor on, then let us go." She placed a black half-mask across her face, tying its silk strings behind her head, and put her hand upon his arm so lightly he could scarcely feel her touch. He glanced down at her appreciatively. The topmost curl of her coiffure barely reached his shoulder. "What are you made up as?" he asked. "The Empress Josephine?" Her eyes came up to his, wide with astonishment, and her lips parted in an indulgent smile for an obviously silly question. "I, the Empress of the French? But no, bon ami. I am nothing but poor little Clotilde Deschamps, who goes out only as herself." Sudden laughter bubbled up through her smile. "La la," she exclaimed. "C'est drôle, hein? What's so funny?" "Me. I have let you hold me in your arms. We have kissed each other. We are going to the ball masked together, and I do not even know your name. Oh, hey, but it is scandaleux. It is infamous, n'est-ce pas?" Her laughter tinkled like a silver bell swung in the wind. "I'm Horace Holloway," he answered, as his chuckle matched her higher merry laugh. "It is a little unconventional, but—" "I like your name," she broke in, half gaily, half seriously. "It suits you very well. Horace was a poet, and I think that you are that. The very look of you says so. Even if you write no verse, your heart is filled with poesy. And Holloway, a road that holds no traffic, no passengers, n'est-ce pas? Bon, I accept your poetry, my friend, and as for emptiness, cannot you find room in your heart for Clotilde?" As unaffectedly as a child, she turned her face up to his and waited for his kiss, eyes closed, lips a little parted. He kissed her slowly, and she put both arms around his neck as she stood on tiptoe and pressed against him. How sweet, he thought, sweeter than the heart of a rose, sweeter than the mists of happiness, far too sweet. For deep within him a small bell seemed ringing, sounding a faint warning tocsin of alarm. Despite the allure of her pale, smooth skin, her bright vermilion lips and jet-black hair, despite her sweetness and her unaffected, trustful ardor, there was something vaguely frightening about her, some subtle, secret suggestion of the femme fatale, the vampire, the ruin of men's souls and bodies. She linked her arm in his and laced her fingers in his hands as they resumed their walk. When did it happen to you?" she asked suddenly. He studied the question a long moment. She had a quaint way of expressing herself with her queer jumble of slow, stilted English and quick, ebullient French. "How do you mean?" he countered. She seemed to ponder in her turn. Then, softly, as if the question were embarrassing, "When did you become like me? Like us?" "Oh!" Understanding flickered through the fog of his perplexity. Even if her words were obscure, the apparent self-consciousness of her hesitant speech gave him his cue. "It must have happened when I first saw you by the old cemetery, my dear." "Mon Dieu!" Her laugh began as a soft, throaty chuckle and rose to a high, silvery tinkle. "But it is you who say the sweet, droll things, my Horace. Next you will be telling me that I shot Cupid's dart at you and pierced your heart and laid you low. I think you did, he answered, and in the shadow just outside the disk of light cast by a street lamp, they stopped and kissed each other again. Somehow the streets seemed different, not changed exactly, but not quite as he remembered them. The curbside lamp posts seemed farther apart, and their lanterns shed less light. The houses, too, seemed smaller, newer, better kept, and here and there he could perceive dimly a sort of shadow hovering over them, as if the faint mirage of larger and more modern buildings poised above them. His sense of direction was blunted by these odd mutations, but as nearly as he could determine they had come to Orleans Street when his companion guided him round the corner and down the block. Midway between what he thought Bourbon and Royal Streets, there stood a plain, low building of whitewashed brick that made him think of a warehouse, but through the narrow windows piercing its walls, brilliant lights shone. They crossed the street and mounted the low steps that led to the wide doorway. Inside the place was a kaleidoscope of gaiety. Chandeliers that dripped with scintillating crystal prisms shed the soft, brilliant glow of candlelight on everything. The walls of paneled precious woods were hung with oil paintings. Some depicted landscapes, some pastoral scenes, more showing classic gods and goddesses, or gentlemen and ladies dressed like them, engaged in rather naughty goings-on, while the bright faces of 100 mirrors echoed and re-echoed the frolicsome scene. Somehow it made him think of the bright prints and paintings of Gros, Gerard, David, and Ingres, which showed the life of Paris during the Directorate and the First Empire so delightfully. The dancers circling round the floor of quarter-sawed waxed oak were almost every sort of costume imaginable. Here a gentleman in the white coat and powdered hair of a French officer of Bourbon days swung past with a frail, lovely lady in hoop-skirts in his arms. A little farther off, a man in the tight pantaloons and long coat of the Directoire period danced with a girl who wore the neoclassic costume of Napoleon's court, while here and there was to be seen a suit of severe black broadcloth, but with the frilled shirt and stock collar of the early 19th century. "Shall we dance?" asked his companion when he had found a place for his rifle, and placed her left hand in his right while she laid the other on his collar so lightly that it might have been a butterfly taking momentary rest there. The music was three-quarter time, but the dance was not quite familiar. The step was quicker than the waltz he knew, and the couples whirled and turned and pirouetted so constantly that he was almost by the time they had completed a circuit of the great ballroom. "You have money, yes?" she asked, as they paused, out of breath, before the door of a long, brightly lighted room from which the clatter of roulette wheels and the click of dice sounded. "A little," he replied, shoved his way through a throng of people, groped about a roulette table, and tendered a $5 bill to the impassive croupier. "Combien? How much?" the man asked, and Holloway saw with surprise that he too wore a black half-mask across his face. "Tout," he replied, "I'll shoot the works," and received a handful of gilded plaques about the size of checkers. Half of these he handed to Clotilde, who placed them on a red square marked 23, as the croupier announced in a flat, toneless voice, "Le jeu est fait, messieurs et dames. Rien ne va plus. The play has commenced. No more bets are to be placed," and spun the wheel. The people crowding round the table became so still the clatter of the little ball in the wheel was like the rattle of hailstones on a tin roof. Motionless, with parted lips, raised eyebrows, and craned necks, they watched the spinning wheel and the little ivory sphere that danced in it. "Victoire rouge, messieurs, madames," the croupier's bored voice proclaimed as the wheel lost momentum and the ivory pellet, spinning in it, came to rest. A woman laughed, a high, thin titter of hysteria, and staggered drunkenly from the room. A man rose from his place, looked round him with a sickly smile, and lurched toward the doorway, and half a dozen eager players crowded forward for their places. Mon Dieu, but I have won!" Clotilde cried ecstatically and clapped her hands like a delighted child. "I am rich, me!" Her bet had been $2, and the croupier pushed a pile of coin and bills toward her with one hand, while, with a little wood rake held in the other, he gathered in the wagers of the losers. Come, let us celebrate, Adorer. She cooed and drew him toward a line of curtained alcoves at the far side of the room. Champagne it shall be for us, and dozens of those small sweet cakes that I do adore almost as much as I adore you. Mon amoureux, hola. Hola, she called to a velvet-coated black masked waiter who went hurrying past. A bottle of champagne, and many, many petit fours. Mon petit garçon noir, and the waiter, a gigantic Negro, grinned appreciation of her pleasantry and calling him her small black boy. Well, it was written in 1947. The champagne frothed and bubbled in their goblets, but to Holloway it seemed to lack substance, as if it were but little more than chilled air he sipped, and the little sugared cake, delectable to look at, were flat, tasteless, and unsubstantial as crumbs of Chinese rice cookies. Clotilde seemed to enjoy them hugely, however, and as she sipped champagne and nibbled small pink and white iced cakes, the color rose in her pale cheeks until they glowed a lovely pearly rose, and a new sparkle came into her eyes. Now I think we dance some more, she suggested, as she rose and stretched a hand to him. And after that we play some more roulette until he has no more money left. Then we shall drink some more champagne with peaches in him and eat some more petit fours. Yes, he assented as he followed her to the ballroom. It was crazy as a hashish eater's dream, a scene straight out of the Arabian Nights with overtones of the left bank. He knew it couldn't possibly be happening. Things like this just didn't happen, and women, like Clotilde, did not exist. But that did not matter. For the first time since his return from the army, he was happy, deliriously, feverishly happy. On with the dance. Let there be madder music and stronger wine. The candles in the crystal chandeliers cast golden light on everything. Clotilde's small, slim waist lay sweetly in the circle of his arm. Her laughing eyes looked into his. Her lips were parted just a little to show the tips of small white teeth. They whirled about the long room, reached the door of the gaming salon, and paused for breath, laughing with sheer happiness, as only children and lovers know how to do. "Shall we assail the battlements of fortune once more?" she asked as he released her from his embrace. "We may win more this time, and oh, pardonnez-moi, monsieur, mille pardon." As she wheeled, she had collided with a young man carrying a silver tray on which were 2 goblets of champagne, and the spilled wine splashed across the rippling ruffles of his dress shirt. There was a moment's silence, while she waited contritely for his word of forgiveness, and Holloway could see the young man's florid face behind his mask go slowly gray, as if the blood drained from it. Deliberately he drew a lace-edged handkerchief from his cuff, blotted his soiled ruffles with it, then turning on Clotilde, whispered in a cold voice, "Cochonnette noire, little black pig." She cried out as if she had been struck, and the blood swept up her throat and cheeks and brow in a quick, outraged blush. Holloway hit from the hip and felt the man's jaw collapse under the impact. His body curved back under the shock, and he sprawled like an upset tailor's dummy, inert and loose-limbed, on the waxed floor. "But you are marvelous," Clotilde told him as they entered the game room. "You strike like the ball of a cannon, my Horace." She gave a small, ecstatic giggle. "He looks so stupid lying there all sprawled out like a spider." Holloway felt his knuckles, which still smarted from the force of their collision with the man's jaw. "I wish I hadn't knocked him out with the first swing," he answered. "I'd like to have another go with him." "Oh, but you will, bon ami, assuredly." "Think he'll come back for more?" "He will demand the satisfaction, certainly. He cannot do less in honor." "I'll be ready to meet him whenever." "Be sure to choose the firearms, chérie. Do not let them trick you into fighting with the Colchermard or épée. He is a famous duelist, that one. I know him, me, and would surely run you through at the first pass." "For heaven's sake," he burst in, "do you mean that I'm expected to fight a duel with that little stinker? I'll be hanged if I do. If he wants more of the same, I've got it right on ice for him. But a duel? Good Lord, people just don't do that sort of thing today." "Ah, Horace, You would not put shame on me. You would not have them say I came to the bal masque with a poltron for my protector. They will surely brand you as a coward if you refuse to meet him, mon Dieu. I think I see them coming now. Be easy, sweetheart, he soothed, patting the tense fingers which had clasped on his arm. If I'd get you in wrong by refusing to fight this guy, I'll meet him any time and place he wants to name and shoot the pants off him. Walking elbow to elbow, two young men were coming toward them. One wore the gold-laced white coat of a French officer of the days of Bourbon ascendancy. The other was in sober black, but scarcely less ornate than his military companion. His shirt of finely tucked linen cambric was trimmed with row on row of lace in which there gleamed studs of green jade set with black pearls. A diamond buckle held the wide black ribbon of his stock. The buttons of his low-cut waistcoat were bright silver. Both men came to a halt as if obeying a command, struck their heels together, and with right hands on their hearts and left behind them, jackknifed forward in a formal bow. Monsieur. Holloway was not to be outdone. Drawing himself up as if to attention, he inclined frigidly, in what was little more than the suspicion of a bow. At your services, messieurs. The young soldier, who seemed to recognize Holloway as a member of his craft, spoke first. We have the honor to represent Monsieur Médard de la Tour, and on his behalf to demand satisfaction for the blow that you have given. Holloway racked his memory for the proper response. Vaguely he knew he should have a second, but how to go about securing it? At last, I have no one to act as second for me, messieurs, he answered, but if you will have the kindness to procure me one, I shall be happy to put my interests in his hands. Très bien. It was the young officer again. Me, I have nothing else to do. I shall be honored to act as your second, monsieur. He paused with raised eyebrows. Holloway, the other responded. Horace Holloway, late of the United States Army. That sounded impressive, especially when he neglected to add that he had been Corporal Holloway. All three exchanged curt formal bows again, and the civilian left to inform Monsieur de la Tour how things progressed, while the young soldier remained. I am the Chevalier de Broglie, he announced, and as a gentleman of France, he bowed low to Clotilde, I offer my profound apologies for the affront my ci-devant principal offered mademoiselle. Clotilde dropped him a deep curtsy, and the young officer turned to Holloway. As for the blow you gave monsieur, he grinned boyishly, it was a lovely thing to see, and I can say only a marvel. Well done. I trust that you will be successful on the field of honor as in the ballroom a moment since. Now, to business. As the challenged party, you have the right to name the time and place of meeting and the weapons to be used. What are your preferences? Something about pistols and coffee for two at daybreak popped into Holloway's memory. Why not tomorrow morning at sunrise in St. Anthony's Square, he hazarded. I've heard that is a favorite place for— Monsieur, I fear that you forget, de Broglie interrupted coldly. You know as well as I that this affair must be concluded at once. Your jest is not in the best of taste. Holloway was amazed at his sudden coolness, but let it pass without comment. Very well, one time's as good as another. Make it long rifles at 40 paces behind St. Louis Cathedral. His second bowed and hastened off, and Clotilde looked at him reproachfully. Oh, Horace, adorer, how could you? She asked almost tearfully. How could I what, dear? Make such reference to the morning. You know as well as I that with the breaking of the dawn we must— Mon Dieu, here comes de Broglie now. Be careful, heart of my heart. He is a good shot, that one, and may injure you. Be sure to fire first. Impulsively she held out both hands, and he bent above them, kissing each in turn. Gigantic oak trees, bearded with long garlands of gray Spanish moss, stood solemn, black and silent at the edges of their park. Their almost bare limbs seemed uplifted as if to evoke malignant spirits from the winter sky. From the distance came the moaning of violins as the orchestra in the dance hall played on, but in the square an awe quiet reigned. Like drifting shadows, men moved on their grim errands of setting the stage for the duel. A gentleman in a long cloak and broad black hat who looked like a conspirator in a melodrama paced off the course. Two more set stakes in the short grass where the combatants were to stand. The seconds, conferring in whispers, watched while two others loaded Holloway's long rifle and another like it for his antagonist. Messieurs! The umpire stepped forward with upraised hand. He was a tall, commanding figure in a tight blue uniform piped with gold and scarlet braid and with gold epaulets on his shoulders. The upper portion of his face was obscured by his black mask and the lower half by a wide, curling mustache and a short black beard. He spoke French with the cautious precision of a slight accent. Holloway had the impression he was a Spaniard, but could distinguish little from his unfamiliar uniform. Messieurs, this is a duel between Monsieur Medard de la Tour of Nouvelle Orleans and Monsieur Horace Holloway of the United States Army to avenge a blow given and received. The principals will stand at 40 paces from each other, armed with rifles. I shall say, fire, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the combatants will discharge their pieces between the words fire and 5. One shot only will be exchanged. Are you ready, gentlemen? Young Chevalier de Broglie handed Holloway his rifle with a smile. Bonne chance, mon ami, he whispered. Aim for the eye holes in his mask and just a little low. These rifles have a tendency to elevate their bullets. With the rifle ready, Holloway awaited the command. In the moonlight-softened darkness, de la Tour loomed like a spot of darker shadow uncertainly defined against the duskiness of the great oak boles. He had buttoned his coat tightly and tied a black silk handkerchief about his throat, so he was in unrelieved black from head to foot, with no highlight to sight on. Clever little devil, Holloway muttered as he weighed it in his hand, but I don't think it'll get him much. He hadn't earned his expert rifleman's badge for nothing, and potting skillfully camouflaged Jap snipers had been an everyday chore for him in the jungle. The buttons on his adversary's coat were silver and shone with a dull luster in the moonlight. The second one on the left side should be almost above his heart. He'd put a slug through it as sure as God made little apples. Killing in war had been impersonal. You shot and were shot at. If the other fellow's bullet had your name on it, you were done for. If you had his number on your slug, he was. This was different. That grinning little monkey yonder had insulted Clotilde. Only one shot would be exchanged, eh? All right, if that was how they wanted it. He'd killed better men with one shot. The umpire's voice broke through his reverie. Attendez, messieurs. Fire, 1, 2. Bright orange flashes stabbed the darkness, and the reports of the rifles were so close that one seemed but the prolongation of the other. Holloway saw a slim arc of silver hurtle through the gloom like a small meteor, where his bullet clipped de la Tour's coat button. But de la Tour did not go down. He stood, rifle in hand, and looked at him as if he saw some fearful apparition. Then, slipping down his left arm from the shoulder, he felt the warm ooze of blood, and knew he had been hit, though if his wound were light or serious he did not know. A hum of talk, the sort of frightened whispering that precedes a panic, ran from man to man among the witnesses to the duel. They looked at the blood seeping through his buckskin shirt with bright, fear-burnished eyes, and one or two raised trembling, frightened hands to point to the stain. Sacre Dieu, he heard de Broglie exclaimed. He is one of them! Slowly, fearfully, they shrank back to the shadows of the oaks, as men who see a frightful spectre might give way before it, yet fear to turn and flee, lest it set on them from behind. What the devil! He took a step toward the terror-stricken group, and they shrank from him as if he were plague personified. There was a rustle in the oleander bushes growing at the park's border, and Clotilde came toward him, breathing with quick, jerking gasps, the eyes behind her mask a glaze of sickened fear. Horace, she spoke thickly through the fear-stiffened lips, is it truly thou? Of course, dear, and I'm not badly hit. That fellow couldn't shoot fish in a barrel. He took a step toward her, but she shrank back, hands upraised as if to ward some terror from her. Don't come too near, she begged, and he could see that she was using all her self-control to keep from turning and flying. What is it? He demanded. Everyone, his late antagonist, his second, all the men, and now Clotilde, shrank from him as if he were a putrescent corpse. Tell me, Clotilde. Did you not know, truly? She asked, tremblingly. Of course I don't. You know not who we are? She seemed to grasp her courage with both hands, holding it by main strength. No, we are the dead. Once every year upon the eve of Mercredi de Cendres, Ash Wednesday, it is permitted us to leave the tomb and come back to the scenes we knew in life and seeming flesh. Upon this single night in all the year, it is permitted that we laugh and love and be as gay as in the days when we were living. Those who loved in life may then renew their sweet communion. Those who fought and hated may take up their quarrels if they desire. The city is the same as it was in the days of old, for time moves not for the dead. He stared at her stupidly, made a move toward her, and she gave way a faltering step. Forgive me, chérie, I would not hurt you, but as the living fear the dead, so we dead fear and shrink from the living. You are terrible to us. So have a little patience with poor frightened Clotilde, whose love is greater than her fear, but not much greater. How could I know? When I saw you outside the cemetery in your costume of the ancient days, I thought that you were one of us, and though I did not know who you might be, my heart yearned toward you. Then when you passed my house, I knew that you had followed me, and I was glad, so I dropped my flower down to you, and you came up to me. But the time is short. I must hasten. Do not interrupt. You will remember that I asked you when it happened as we walked down Royal Street. I meant, when were you killed? Me, I was stricken with the plague the year that General Jackson held the city British, but you seemed of an earlier day, like one of Governor Kerlerec's Kentucky legionnaires who held the forest pathways for New France. And when you told me that it happened when we met, I thought you spoke the lover's jest, and I was so delighted with the pretty compliment that I did not press you for an answer. When you accepted de la Tour's challenge, I followed to meet you, as you came from the Champ d'Honneur, for I well knew that though a sword or bullet could give you great pain, those who are already dead cannot be killed again. So though you might be sorely wounded, there would still be a few minutes in which we could share this newfound love. But when I saw your blood begin to flow, I knew that you were one of them, the dreadful living, whom we fear so much. But you just said that you love me, he broke in. If that's so, surely. Alas, my heart, within the grave there is no loving. Twixt you and me there is a gulf no love can bridge. Not even if you died could you come to me, for I know not why it is, I know only that it is so. Our company is made up of those who died many years ago. Not only life and death, but time as well is set between us like a wall. The night was tiring rapidly, and in the eastern sky a faint gray streak edged with the palest rose began to show. She came a little nearer, fearfully, but with a loving courage that outfaced her fear, and it seemed to him that suddenly there blew so soft a perfume in the fading dark that he could almost see it take shape. She kept looking at him. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted as she breathed faster. Suddenly, she snatched the satin mask from her face and flung herself into his arms. "Oh, Horace, mi ami, je t'aime, je t'adore." She was sobbing with heart-shattering sobs, fighting hard for breath, but her eyes were bright and steady with mingled adoration and renunciation. Un dernier embrassement, one last kiss, she besought in a tearful whisper and raised her face to his. He held her to him a long, trembling moment. He could feel her heart beat with quick, light strokes like the ticking of a watch. She gave a little tortured moan and became limp and yielding in his arms, then twined her hands about his neck, pulling his lips hard against hers and drawing her body against his. "Adieu," she whispered brokenly. "Adieu, adieu, coeur de mon coeur, pour le temps et pour l'éternité." The world about them seemed to have stopped in its course for a long moment by some formula of potent magic. Then, from a belfry somewhere in the distance, a gong sounded. The still air held its echoes till it seemed to quiver, and daylight came so quickly that it seemed a gust of wind had blown the dark away. It was morning, and suddenly his arms were empty. The train wheels clicked with an insistent melody as compelling as the kettle drums in Ravel's Bolero. Holloway sat in the club car with his glass of bourbon untasted before him as he the flat, marshy landscape and the bare trees with their dreary streamers of gray Spanish moss. Like funeral crepes, he thought. Save for the stiffness in his left shoulder where his slight wound pained no longer, he might have been convinced that he had dreamt it all. Clotilde, the masked ball, the duel in the moonlight behind the cathedral. He was going back to New York, back to work and everyday prosaic sanity. He'd meet his friends again, make new contacts, take life up where he left off when he put on the uniform. He'd find an anodyne for broken dreams in work. There would be other women. He laughed suddenly, so harshly that the fat man across the aisle put down his copy of the Times and stared at him. Other women, vibrant, living, flesh and blood creatures. He knew as he knew that he lived and breathed, that flesh of phantom, lovely dream or sweet reality. Clotilde Deschamps, who died in 1814 and lay buried in St. Louis Cemetery, was the one and only love of his life, that always while he lived his heart would cleave to her memory as constantly as the tides swing to the moon.